afternoon. Thanks, everyone, for joining our presentation. I think we're just going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes just while people are continuing to join in. But while we're waiting for everyone, I will go ahead and just share a few housekeeping items with you. So today's presentation is called Connecting the Dots, How to Build World-Class Workforce Analytics in Your Organization. My name is Sarah Enders. I'll be moderating and organizing the webinar. Like I said, I just wanted to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. First, I would like to ask that we just save all questions until the end of the webinar. We will have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. You will have the ability to ask questions in the questions panel. To ask a question, you just type your question within the questions panel and hit send. These questions will come to us, and then at the end of the presentation, we will do a Q&A session and take as many questions as we have time for. So with that being said, I'm going to go. I think we can get started. I'll turn it over to Reagan Klein. Reagan's the Director of Workforce Planning and Analytics at EPI-USE. So go ahead, Reagan.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar on how to build a rockstar workforce analytics organization. My name is Reagan Klein, and I'm a Principal Consultant at EPI-USE, where I work specifically with our workforce analytics and planning clients. Before joining EPI-USE, I was a Principal Consultant at SuccessFactors in a very similar role, again, helping workforce analytics and planning clients leverage their investment in workforce analytics technology. And prior to joining the consulting world, I actually ran a workforce analytics and planning program for a healthcare insurance provider here in Southern California. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Mick Collins from SuccessFactors, and I'll turn it over to Mick so he can also give a quick introduction about himself.
Thank you, Reagan. Good afternoon, everybody. Mick Collins. I'm part of the workforce analytics team at SuccessFactors. I have about 9 years of experience in this space with SuccessFactors, and then prior to that, Inform and CLC Metrics. And really divide my responsibilities across working with our customer organizations to deliver value on the investments they've made in workforce analytics and planning, and also doing what I can to really share some of the great stories coming out of our customer base in the form of presentations and webinars. So really is the most favorite part of my job is to sit down and discuss findings like we have here today. So delighted to be part of this session. Reagan, if you want to move forward to the next slide, this really is the #1 question we're going to address. We're going to share with you a range of really great findings. Quite a few of those were surprising to us, and I think they'll be surprising to you as well. But we don't want to share so much data that we miss some of the key points that we want to get out of the presentation today. And really fundamentally what you see here is the top question, which is how do you then decide what is the most important next step that you can take in order to improve how your managers are using data for talent decisions? How do we get beyond just providing more and more data without the insights that are needed to help your managers and your leaders use that information for better talent management decision making? So we're going to take you through a range of data points here, but keep that in the back of your mind, and at the very end of the presentation today, we'll come back and share with you what we think those next steps might be. So let me just provide a very quick bit of background to our organizations and to the survey itself. As I mentioned, I am part of the SuccessFactors organization. We are a global leader in business execution. So across all of our talent management products, we're really looking to understand how companies make better business decisions and how their workforce contribute to those decisions. We have recruiting, learning, core talent management like performance and goals. We have a next generation HIS system called Employee Central. And surrounding all of that is our workforce analytics and strategic workforce planning. And really, 2 parts of our mission with these products. One is to increase the effectiveness of talent management decision making. The second is much more personal, which is helping HR professionals build very rewarding careers now by having access and building a core competency around analytics. And we'll talk more about some of the data we found in the survey that gets back to that idea of core competencies in just a moment. Let me turn it back to Reagan. She'll take take you through EPI-USE, and then we'll go into some of the survey background.
Okay. So starting with the obligatory, who are we and what do we do slide. EPI-USE is a global consulting organization with over 1,000 people in 13 countries around the globe. We're the world's largest SAP partner, and we are now also a global partner for SuccessFactors. We do have a permanent presence in the Americas, the United Kingdom, continental Europe, Asia Pacific, and Africa. And in our 30-year history, we've been involved in more than 500 human capital consulting projects around the world. And more recently, we've launched a dedicated global professional practice for workforce analytics and planning. So starting with a quick background on the survey research and the methodology that we used, this past March, EPI-USE and SuccessFactors partnered to conduct a research study on workforce analytics that included organizations across all different industries and sizes from around the globe. So when we were starting to design the survey questions and discuss what we were hoping to achieve with this research, the overarching theme was that we wanted to learn some new things about the workforce analytics industry and make sure that we weren't just repeating the same study that we ran back in 2008. So, of course, trending a few key questions would be great, but we actually decided to completely overhaul the survey design and the question set in hopes that the results would yield new and interesting findings about the progress we've made over the last 5 years, some predictions about where the discipline is headed in the next 5, and what the rock stars out there are doing differently that we can learn from and start applying in our own organizations to get similar results. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the Workforce Analytics Survey was the first in the EPI-USE Visionary Series, which is a line of research studies designed to dig into various human capital issues with the ultimate goal of providing thought-provoking findings. So definitely be on the lookout for more research study invitations in the future. And we will also be emailing a copy of the research report from today's session to everyone on the line as well. And before I move on, I do want to give a quick thank you to everyone on the line who participated in the 2013 Global Workforce Analytics Survey. We really do appreciate you taking the time to be part of this research. So just a little background info on the folks who participated in the survey. And as you can see, we had nearly 300 respondents in our sample, which is great. In terms of size, we received returns from a range of small, medium, and large organizations, although the biggest cluster of responses did come from those employing 10 to 30,000 employees. And in terms of industry, there was no dominant sector. High tech, public sector, and healthcare were the most common, but each represented no more than 10% of total returns. And finally, in terms of region, the dominant number of responses did come from North America. As you can see here, it was at about 60%. And Asia Pacific had the second largest population of respondents. And now I'll turn it back over to Mick to give us a little bit more information about the survey design.
Yeah, thanks, Reagan. Before we dive into the survey results itself, we wanted really just to discuss some of the hypotheses that we put together that govern this survey and some of the surprises that we saw. As you might imagine, many of the findings confirm the hypotheses we have about the maturity of functions and the investments they're making and therefore the returns they get. But in other cases, there were nuances here when we really dug into the data that we thought were very compelling and ones that we wanted to reflect here. So if we turn over to the next slide, we'll share some of those hypotheses with you. So first we wanted to look at how organizations are making investments in technology and process management and the extent to which those investments are actually helping them either be a more strategic HR function or are delivering what they would define as being business impact. And it's important in the very top left-hand side that compared to surveys we've run in 2008, as Reagan mentioned, and years prior to that, there's ever greater awareness of workforce analytics. Barely a week goes by that there's not an article in the Wall Street Journal or McKinsey Quarterly or HBR about people chiefs using the data they have access to. So I think in many cases we're almost bombarded with the big data or the Moneyball message. We wanted to see whether that's actually having an effect in terms of how HR functions are delivering value. Clearly from the results we see, many of you have said the enablement technology in HR across the entire talent management footprint has certainly improved in the last 4 to 5 years. More companies now have access to more next generation systems like recruiting, marketing, for example, that perhaps weren't there 5 years ago. And those new systems are helping HR better manage recruiting and performance and survey processes. And we did find that for some organizations, in fact about 65% of organizations said because of these investments in technology, there is an increase or an improvement in how the HR function is serving as a strategic partner to the organization. However, when we looked at the actual elements of business impact, so for example, the ability to generate cost savings, a bit more hit and miss when it came to that. So certainly lots of great work being done, lots of systems that can help organizations today. We're still on the maturity curve in terms of demonstrating real-world business impact of using talent management data. Second hypothesis here, really no surprise to anybody. We would expect that more mature programs, those with at least 3 years of experience in delivering workforce analytics, would deliver more tangible results. And that was certainly the case. We have some interesting findings later on about how the mature firms compare to rock stars. We have definitions around how we think about a rock star analytics organization. But no surprise here, we would expect those organizations with more tenure to deliver better results. And so one of the themes towards the end of the survey is, how do you close the gap? If you don't have 3 to 5 years worth of tenure, what things can you start to do today that can close that gap? It was interesting that year 2 was really the tipping point for showcasing the value of workforce analytics. I'm sure for many of you there is great excitement about analytics. We have executive engagement, we have a business case, we have a burning platform to address with analytics right now. What we often see is it takes a couple of years to embed those processes as part of HR functional practices. So we make this investment, we start to deliver data, and over time the organization becomes acclimatized to expecting workforce analytics data and just becomes part of the business process. And from what we saw in the survey, year 2 was really that tipping point here. And then finally here on the left-hand side, world-class analytics is a combination of naturally stronger processes and better outcomes. And Reagan did a wonderful job of really separating out those organizations that we define as rock stars. And what do rock stars do differently to everybody else? Well, firstly, they integrate their financial data with their workforce data. Really a message that I think everyone has heard about over the last couple of years, looking at financials, looking at compensation and benefits. No surprise also that they're investing in dedicated resources. The concept of having a center of excellence or an analyst to be able to manage this program is important, and they're also making investments in technology as well. And ultimately, they're helping people at senior levels make better decisions. What's interesting to me is there's always a talk around using data to save costs. I mean, ultimately, that is in many cases HR's responsibility to manage costs. But if we're talking about building assets within our talent base, there's a great opportunity moving forward to look at the revenue impact of workforce analytics. And Rockstars are certainly taking that opportunity to really build human capital models that help drive revenue, more so than simply looking at cost management or risk management or strategy execution. So interesting set of findings we thought really challenging some of our assumptions about these hypotheses. If we turn to the next slide, we can go through some of the other interesting points about this survey that we found. So when we designed the survey, we separated out some of the perception questions versus some of the reality questions. So we didn't ask, what do you think, and then what do you do next to one another. We separated them out, and then we brought that information together. So what you see here on the left-hand side in the first column is what do respondents say about their organization, their perception of how analytics is used right now. In the middle is more so about, well, what's the actual practice? And then on the right-hand side, some thoughts from our perspective in terms of what this might mean for you. So, for example, on the left-hand side here, 59% of organizations strongly agree that their organization highly values workforce analytics. In reality, that's perhaps not borne out by the resources dedicated to this. On average, organizations having one workforce analyst to 50 business analysts. That was the most commonly reported ratio that we saw. Now, it's not the case that in order to value analytics, you have to have resources, but the reality is Rockstars have those resources in place. And so without proper resourcing, you might not be able to capitalize on the value of analytics if we just don't have the people that are skilled and have the right environment to be able to deliver analytics to managers around the firm. Likewise, in the very middle of the page here, 28% of respondents said that increasing productivity is a top challenge in 2013. And the reality is that 70% of organizations don't use their data to demonstrate increased revenue. So we think it's still very important to use data to manage costs, but is there an opportunity to really look at the business model and say, are there one or two potential leverage points, areas where we can have the most impact if we're able to tie human capital factors to sales? So better work structure, better training, better team selling, whatever the different factor might be, opportunities there to close that gap between wanting to look at productivity and then actually applying some data to it. And then the final point here at the bottom of the page, 54% of organizations say we review analytics on a weekly or monthly basis. So there's lots of sharing of information taking place. I'm sure many of you are no stranger to spreadsheets or PowerPoints that come your way that have lots of data around the workforce. But in the middle here, 63% of organizations say they're not actually using the data as much as other data when it comes to making those key decisions. So we see a lot of information, we might not use it. And so can we institute a feedback process to make sure that people are actually using the data? I often talk about there's certainly interest and value in having a foundational set of facts that managers should have access to. But if we're looking about getting the biggest bang for our buck, we want to make sure that this data is being used as part of talent management or business decision making, and therefore we need to potentially better understand what's missing from that data that stops it from being used for a specific decision. So I think it's a great page. I think it really starts to bring us some of the dichotomies we see in terms of what people say and what people do. Final point for me before we turn into the results with Reagan herself. First of all, we saw on the next slide great alignment between executives and non-executives when it came to top imperatives. So what areas could the organization benefit most from if they were to use data? Number one in both the executive camp and the non-executive camp, strategic workforce planning. For probably 90% of organizations, workforce planning could be extremely beneficial. For those other 10% who have no issue in finding all of the talent they need, workforce planning probably less of an issue. But we see for most firms, which is borne out by research that says talent shortages are a major risk, workforce planning could be one way in which data might be used today to potentially preempt some of those gaps as your employees retire or they move to other organizations. Can we do some proactive work to forecast who might leave and how it is we're going to replace them? Generally speaking, executives have more alignment within their own group in terms of the top issues. Managers, on the right-hand side, the non-executives, more variation in terms of some of the different topics they were looking at. So I think coming out of this, one thought that we had was, how do we better help you understand what those top priorities might be, so we're not just data mining for data mining's sake and hopefully turning up an issue that somebody cares about, but we actually have a plan in place where we know that if we deliver engagement results that impact the bottom line, we know that our executives are going to pay attention to that firstly, and then change some kind of HR policy or practice secondly. With that opening salvo, I'm going to turn to Reagan now. We'll start to take you through some of the overall findings. We'll go into what makes a rockstar analytics function different from everybody else, and then close with some of those next steps. So let me turn back to Reagan here.
Okay, thanks, Mick. So as Mick said, we're going to start digging into some of the data now and talk through some of the really interesting findings. Okay, so we've already touched on this key finding a little bit earlier when Mick discussed our hypotheses, but to illustrate the point here, you can see that most organizations have invested in enablement technology, but this hasn't necessarily helped HR be able to demonstrate impact on the bottom line as much as we would have expected. The data is very much in line with our hypothesis, with the largest improvements over the past 5 years really being centered around things like enablement technology and HR process design. But there are also some big numbers here in the strategic space. So we're seeing 67% say that HR uses data to drive decision making, and 64% are saying that HR is a more strategic partner to the business. But the most interesting data point to me is the one at the bottom here, where only 32% of organizations report an improvement in HR's ability to demonstrate impact on the bottom line. And actually what's even more interesting is the other end of the scale, where you can see that the largest response was that there was actually little to no improvement at all in this area. So what this tells me is that there is a bit of a disconnect here, because one of the key ways that HR can be a more strategic partner to the business is to be able to demonstrate impact. So we definitely have some work to do here. So a while back, Mick and I actually did some research on workforce analytics in the boardroom, and what we found was that reaching the board of directors is a very real challenge. And this data here very much supports that, because we found that the board is actually looking for more of the ROI analysis, that impact analysis. So it would make sense that workforce data isn't necessarily being used at the board level if HR is still having difficulty getting that information out there and connecting those dots for senior leaders. So to expand on that, we can see here that only 4% report using workforce data in decision-making at the board level on a constant basis. And even when it's combined with that often group, it's still under 30%. But there is an opportunity here to get in front of this audience so that workforce analytics is a key data input into all strategic decisions. Because this is one of those key differentiators of Rockstar Workforce Analytics program. So it's something we need to get better at. So if your board is using workforce data to make decisions constantly, then that's awesome. If it's often, that's great. But if it's other than that and it's hit or miss, then you're missing out on an opportunity to really leverage workforce analytics to drive value in your organization.
Yeah, Reagan, from my perspective, I think this is really interesting. Obviously, we've oriented much of our research towards the board of directors, knowing that many organizations do have CEO or C-suite scorecards, but is there an opportunity to deliver data to a different governing body? I recall that there was a McKinsey study probably about 10 to 12 years ago that looked at the amount of time that the board of directors looks at different topics, and as you might expect, financial results and operational details consume most of the board of directors' agenda. HR or human capital was at the very bottom. I think 3% of the board of directors' time went to human capital reviews, which was the same amount of time that went towards logistics reviews, which I think was really setting up the next meeting. So by actually providing on a more regular basis human capital data to the board of directors, yes, on one hand, we increase the likelihood that decisions get made, but HR starts to elevate itself up that list of potential agenda items alongside the financial aspects or the operational aspects of managing an organization. And so it's great to see for those firms, like what I talked to this week, that presents data to every board of directors meeting. They just get used to having the repetitions there, and human capital is seen as being intertwined with other data provided to the board versus being a standalone agenda item that is sometimes or rarely covered.
Right, exactly. So we know that the board's not really great about consistently using workforce data as an input for decision making, but it would appear that it's actually a little more widespread than that, because we can see here that the majority report using workforce analytics significantly less than other analyses when making key decisions. But we know that this isn't impossible, because 13% of respondents are doing this really well. And one of the things I can tell you that they do differently is that their HR functions can demonstrate impact on the bottom line. And I'm going to keep tying this back to HR's ability, or the lack thereof, to demonstrate impact on the bottom line, because it really is one of those key differentiators of Rockstar Workforce Analytics programs. And until we get better at doing that, Workforce Analytics is going to keep taking a backseat to other business data like marketing or financial data when the strategic decisions are being made.
Reagan, I think a large part of this is credibility. There's no easy solution to this necessarily. We have seen examples where customers, particularly with strategic workforce planning, have now built the credibility of their function to a point whereby they are brought into more of these market or financial decisions to provide a human capital perspective. But a lot of this comes back to data credibility as well. And I know that recently the Corporate Leadership Council issued its first quarter research study specifically on workforce analytics, and they're talking even more so now about how senior HR leaders need to own the vision for workforce analytics and then execute upon that vision. One element will be to make sure that we have credible data, that we have resources that are able to ask better questions, to mine the information, to deliver the results as well. So a lot of this comes back to building that level of credibility. So it's very thought-provoking, because we do want to include human capital data alongside these other points, but in many cases there's a ramp to get there, and I think it often starts with the credibility of the workforce analytics function itself.
Yep, absolutely. So, And it's not that data isn't being used to make any decisions. In fact, as you can see here, workforce data is being used as an input for decisions across a variety of the talent management functions. But most organizations are using it primarily to manage turnover and succession. And the succession piece was a bit surprising to us. Turnover was expected for sure, but succession was a really interesting one because usually succession is not a data-driven process. It's more qualitative in nature, and it's based on competencies and personalities. So what we would have expected to see here is improving selection, because usually being more strategic about staffing is a key part of the workforce planning agenda, and usually analytics as well. So we would have definitely expected to see that way higher on the list and certainly above succession. But this is definitely a trend that I'm seeing more and more with our clients, where one of the goals of the Workforce Analytics program is to be able to better report on and analyze the succession pipeline. And it also sparked a thought for me that this might actually be linked in part to board requests, because when we did our research a year or so ago, one of the topics that was highlighted as a key interest point by the board was succession. And a lot of the board reports I've worked on with clients have some key metrics around high potentials or successor coverage. So definitely top of mind for the board.
And Reagan, what also catches my eye here is at the very bottom of the page, so discontinue an existing program or policy after quantifying ROI. In many cases, we feel as though we're adding more to the HR agenda. We could do more with our recruiting, more with our onboarding, more with our engagement. But there's also an opportunity to potentially use the data to deprioritize a particular program or practice. And I certainly saw this from an article on Southern Company a couple of years ago, where the interviewee there talked more about how they battle to try to reduce the size of the HR agenda. So across the board, they're going to make those major investments in the practices whereby they see a great potential future ROI. But in the work they've done in previous years, if they feel as though they've met their standards, they're going to deprioritize that from the human capital agenda for the coming year. So also an opportunity, I think, to potentially take things off the agenda and explain what great success we've had with that policy or practice, before we then focus more so this year, for example, on managing turnover and increasing the succession pipeline.
Yep, absolutely. I always love to see a stop doing list. So we've talked quite a bit today about the ability to demonstrate impact, but up to this point, we were really talking about the perception of HR's ability to do this, while this question here was attributing the specific impact to workforce analytics efforts. And you can see that while demonstrating costs was doable for over half the respondents, only 22% were able to demonstrate increased revenue, and that's a shockingly low number. What it suggests to me is that we're still struggling with moving past the standard workforce analytics topics like turnover analysis or headcount reports. And we still haven't quite figured out ways to utilize all the great data that we have to illustrate financial business outcomes. And we did include a verbatim comment option with this particular question, and some of the examples that we received were really great. So those were things like one company used workforce analytics to identify and address redundancies. Another organization reported doing analysis on the cost of labor to conduct business. Another one wanted to understand which positions were critical to hire versus those that weren't critical, and that helped them better utilize the workforce capital that they had budgeted for. And the last example we'll share is just another used workforce analytics to improve time to hire, and therefore resulted in a reduction in cost per hire. So all great examples. Now, of course, the challenge to doing analyses like these is that you need to have access to the financial inputs or your sales data. So that's step one. And based on the data on this slide, organizations are definitely finding it easier to demonstrate cost savings than increased revenue. So that might be a great place to start. Either way, this is one of the must-haves for Rockstar Workforce Analytics. So make sure that you're including a financial impact in your analyses, because we all know that dollar signs is how you start to get people's attention.
Reagan, I think my perspective here is this is hard. This is not easy. There's a wealth of effort that goes into just having a good set of foundational metrics and building upon that into performance or talent metrics, and from there into cost savings. Now, I'm under no illusions that this is something that happens overnight, especially given the number of different factors that might account for an increase in revenue, from pricing to customer segmentation to bundles to supply chain. So we're not going to suggest that this is something that every organization should start to do today, but there is the opportunity here to find one or two leverage points, as I mentioned at the very start of the call here, where we can potentially start to build that model that links the investment in XYZ program into some form of increased revenue or greater customer loyalty or customer satisfaction, whatever the different metric might be. But certainly I think a very difficult thing to achieve to begin with without having a good solid foundation underneath.
Sorry, I'm trying to look background. Is that better?
Yeah, Reagan, I was just losing you there for a moment. Are you back on okay?
Hello?
Reagan, you sound
Hi,
okay
Reagan.
now, I think. Just say something.
I just a lot of.
Oh, yeah, you're cutting out.
Let me switch computer. Is that better? No.
It is, yes. I think we can hear you okay now. Oh,
Is that better? No.
it is, yes.
Okay. All right. So in addition to integrating data sources like financials, here are some of the other common challenges organizations are facing with workforce analytics. And data quality was the #1 challenge reported, and this is actually really interesting because back in 2008, data quality was actually #2, and selecting measures that align with strategy was #1. So what we're seeing happening here is that they flip-flopped. But regardless of if it's #1 or #2, clearly both of these were top challenges back then, and they're still top challenges today. So what we can tell you here is that there's always going to be the perception that the data quality isn't as good as it should be. But we have to figure out ways to get past that, and a big part of the workforce analytics process is understanding where we have issues in our data. The data is never going to be perfect, so we need to work with what we have and be able to explain the data issues that we know are there. And if data quality is a big enough issue that it's holding you back from doing workforce analytics in your organization, technology might be a really good way for you to combat the data challenge, because it's going to provide standards for metrics and formulas, but it's also a way to take messy data out of a source HRIS system and put some logic around it to make it more in line with standards for HR reporting and analytics. And although my experience is working primarily with success factors, believe me, the technical guys have worked with every type of bad data out there. So it might be a good option if it's gotten to the point where data quality is really hindering your progress.
Yeah, Reagan, to that point, for some organizations, the mandate will be coming that we need to provide more analytics and metrics and have to get past the data quality issue. And some firms may decide to embark upon a major comprehensive data cleanup exercise. Others may say, let's produce the data and then spot check, essentially. So we're not looking at all of our data points, but if we are delivering a diversity scorecard or we're doing analysis regarding engagement, let's use that as an opportunity to clean those specific data points first and foremost, because we know they're going to have greater visibility overall. So there are ways in which organizations we work with are getting around this, and I do think in many cases that most of the core workforce data is often of great quality. We think it's not the case compared to other functions, but certainly finance has its own issues as well, given how many firms restate their numbers. So I don't think we want to paint ourselves into too dark of a corner with respect to our data quality. It's important. It certainly founds into data credibility, but we also want to be realistic about having educated the organization about the differences between being absolutely correct and directionally correct, and when are we going to be more so the latter.
Great. So looking to the future, the good news is that the vast majority of respondents predict that workforce analytics is not just a fad, and that there will continue to be significant improvements over the next 5 years. In fact, a whopping 81% agree that a core competency of the senior executive's role will be to use workforce data for decision making. And as positive as that sounds, The disappointing news is that only a little more than half of respondents think that HR will be as effective at analytics as other functions. So we still do have a ways to go in order to be seen as an equal. But some of the ways that we can continue making progress here is to do the things we've talked about so far, like demonstrating impact on both the top and bottom lines, getting on the board's agenda more frequently, and using workforce analytics to not only make better talent management decisions, but also to answer more strategic questions that can help drive successful business outcomes. So things like analysis of critical roles or revenue-generating roles. Even so, the future looks bright, and it would appear that workforce analytics will continue to become further embedded in the day-to-day operations of HR. But the question still remains, how do we become a rock star at workforce analytics? And that's what we'll cover in the next section. Okay, so now let's look at the fun stuff. So in order to determine what workforce analytics rock stars do differently than the rest of us, we had to first define what a leader in workforce analytics looks like. And we talk all the time about the end goal of workforce analytics being data-driven decision-making, or using the data we have to make better informed decisions on how to act. So for the purposes of defining a rock star, we wanted to segment out the organizations that are doing just that. And you can see the 3 response criteria listed out here. And so those are, do they use workforce data equal, more, or significantly more than other analyses when making key decisions? They use workforce data at the board of director level constantly or often. And they do end-to-end analytic engagement as a majority or a significant component of their workforce analytics program. And that yielded about 10% of the population, which is what we would expect to see for top performers. On the flip side of that, we wanted to compare and contrast the rock stars to their polar opposites, which we're calling rookies. Now, these are the respondents that answered those 3 questions at the other end of the scale. So they use workforce data significantly less than other data when making key decisions. They rarely or never use data at the board level. And end-to-end analytic engagements are not part of their workforce analytics program. And this group represented about 20% of respondents. So in terms of profiles, the biggest differences between the rock stars and the rookies is that rock stars are concentrated in a few key industries, like high tech, education and research, utilities was up there, so was banking, while the rookies were spread across all industries. And surprisingly, over half of rock stars have, well actually unsurprisingly, over half of rock stars have 2 to 5 years tenure in their workforce analytics programs, while the majority of rookies are still within their first or second year of the workforce analytics program. Okay, so now let's see how these 2 groups stack up against each other. So here we can see that there are some pretty large differences between rockstar and rookie results. And what the green bar represents is just the difference between the 2 groups on each of the questions on the left. So for gaps this large, what this means is that there was a very wide range in responses between these groups. But in general, what we saw was that the largest differences were on the impact questions. So we're actually going to start at the bottom here and work our way up with some of the basic differences between how each of the groups structure their programs. And in general, we can see some of the pretty key differences in programs are that rock stars have a refined set of key metrics that align with corporate strategy. They use dedicated technology, and they have integrated financials. Moving up to the top of the list, we can also see some key differences, and again, the impact measures like demonstrating cost savings, demonstrating revenue, and at the top of the list, we can see that 81% of rockstars regularly do predictive analytics compared to only 3% of rookies. Now, the other one I want to point out is the demonstrating revenue, because to me, this was one of the most significant findings from the whole survey. Not only did 69% of rockstars demonstrate revenue compared to 0% of rookies, but when we compare rockstars to the total population, only 18% of the total said that they had demonstrated increased revenue. So without a doubt, this is one of the key differentiators of rockstar workforce analytics. Rockstars use workforce analytics to demonstrate the revenue returns of investments in talent. They have more structure to their workforce analytics programs, and as a result, their organizations are more likely to place a high value on workforce analytics. So the big question is, does this all translate into action? And the answer is yes. Across the board, rockstars are doing more data-driven decision-making than rookies. And the biggest difference to me is the very last one here, where you can see that 0% of rockstars reported doing nothing with workforce analytics last year, 35% of rookies said they didn't use workforce analytics to make any decisions. So again, the key takeaway here is that we need to be using workforce data to drive decision making. At the end of the day, that's the ultimate goal of workforce analytics, and our recommendation is to start small. You don't need to tackle everything on this list in year 1 or even year 2. But what you are going to want to do is make sure to focus on the 1 or 2 things that are going to be really impactful for your organization. So again, making sure it's something that's top of mind for your leaders. It has clear linkage back to the corporate strategy, and also that it incorporates some financial analysis to demonstrate the impact. So those are the things that Rockstars do differently, and again, are the keys to success in workforce analytics. And to wrap up this section, we'll quickly look at how some of those key populations scored on 3 indices that we created. And as you can see, we've got a resource index, a progress index, and an impact index. And each of these indices is comprised of a subset of the survey questions. And then we gave each of the populations a score on the question set. And what you'll notice here is that when we compare the scores across the populations, the dominant groups are clearly Rockstars, longer tenured workforce analytics programs, and programs using dedicated technology. And of course, there is some overlap there within each of those groups, but even side by side, we can see that they all scored well above the total average on all 3 indices. And what's particularly interesting is the impact index, where we can see that Rockstars are really the only group with a decent score here, and they're at 82%. So again, this clearly illustrates that there are certain things that Rockstars do differently. And what's interesting to me here is that the total population only scored 40% on the impact index, which is really on the low side. So this is definitely an area of opportunity for workforce analytics programs to improve. And it's also a great way to start adding value in your organization today. So again, to sum up, the keys to success here are to have dedicated resources and find ways to demonstrate impact. And now I'll turn it back over to Mick to wrap it up.
Great, thank you, Reagan. I really like that last slide where you've actually brought together multiple data points to really understand from a resource perspective what segments are doing particularly well in that area. So that's one I think I'll have the opportunity to dive back into more, and hopefully folks on the line, once they see the full survey results, will be able to go back into that as well. So we asked this question at the very start of the webcast, and I'm going to take you through some of the initial thoughts we had in terms of next steps. Just a reminder, though, if you do have a question for us, use it in the questions section on the right-hand side. You can send that to us. We can either address that today or talk to you offline about an answer to that question. So we have just about 5 minutes more worth of content here, and then we'll take your questions. So the most important next step you can take, let's look at the next page here, Reagan. So fundamentally, if you've taken anything away from the work so far, it's clearly that organizations that have some level of maturity of this are delivering better results, stronger business impact, better business partnering. So now really is the time to start. And I think, honestly, we've hopefully got past the why workforce analytics and why now questions and really getting into the, well, how do we do this? If we're starting from scratch, or we have somebody who does Excel reporting from us, how do we then start to build some level of maturity and catch up or replicate the success of these firms without having to wait 3 to 5 years to get to this point? So we wanted to provide some guidance, probably more so for those of you who are just getting started with this than those of you that have plans and workforce analytics in place already. So let me take you through a couple of these perspectives here, and we'll take any of the final questions that come in. So from a resource perspective, I think there's a misnomer that in many cases people hear from the likes of Google that have teams dedicated to workforce analytics and say that's just not our model. We just don't have the resources. We actually have to prove value first, and then we'll get the resources. For many of our customers, this process has started with one FTE, or in many cases, half an FTE, somebody who might be split between compensation on one hand and workforce analytics on the other. But there's some sense that we're going to dedicate some person's time to workforce analytics and planning, not just expect it to be the HR business partner or the generalist or the HRS team that actually delivers that information. So think through what resource do we have today in our HR functions that we can potentially co-opt into this program, and now there are other people around the organization that can help us. We can pinch hit, if you will, with people from operations or from finance that have that data-driven background. Secondly, from a technology perspective, in many cases, Excel is very sufficient in producing simple scorecards at the enterprise level, just a couple of key metrics, some data points, perhaps some simple trend analysis. Likewise, bolting on from Excel into Access and SPSS. But let's think through not just what technology you have today and the demand you're meeting, but where do you want to be in 2 to 3 years' time? And if we see an avalanche of requests for customized slicing and dicing of that data coming in, to what extent are we equipped, both from a resource perspective and also from a technology perspective, to address that inflow of demand? It's a great problem to have in many cases, but we need to think through what's the technology landscape likely to be in 2 to 3 years' time that's going to help us serve those needs. Thirdly, standardizing strategic reporting. So away from pure list-based reports or headcount reports, as much as we can standardize to build some credibility and automate to speed the process of our reporting process, not only helps us get data into people's hands and gives them an opportunity to review, ask questions of that information, it also frees up the time of our resource to be able to focus on 1 to 2 particular areas of issue where we can really focus time on doing more detailed analysis. Likewise, to do that, having a regular rhythm of events. We often talk about, we're not looking to add more metrics, more meetings to people's agenda. But what meetings do we have today that we can start to push some more metrics towards? Obviously, senior leadership meetings. Obviously, COE reviews, so recruiting pipeline meetings or performance management processes. But other individuals or other groups in your organization that talk about talent management issues already, where we can push them a small set of refined key metrics that visually have a very clear link between what the responsibility of that group might be and the metrics you're providing. And that will help us free up some advanced analysis time. We're certainly not advocating we're going to dump everything we're doing today and automatically start to do predictive analytics. But are there 1 or 2 areas where we can go a little bit deeper and start to do a little bit more investigation, perhaps between board meetings, and come back with some other insights and balance that with just the regular flow of data going out. Now, asking yourself, does this data help my organization improve its financials, to reduce risk, or does it help execute business strategy? What's the so what of this data? Benchmarking, we're in 2 minds to some point about benchmarks. I think they're beneficial to help set targets. They can be misleading, and the organizations try to move towards the average. So be thoughtful about how you utilize the benchmarks, whether it's external benchmarks or internal benchmarks where you can compare your internal business units, and how that benchmark data might be used. And then finally, can we deliver those metrics that we have defined to different kinds of decision-making bodies? And again, I think Reagan and my perspective is that the board of directors offers a fantastic net new opportunity for us to do more analysis. So I look forward to seeing more presentations where the data is rolling up to a board of directors in addition to other managers around the rest of the organization. Ready to move on to the next slide. In terms of some next steps coming out of this call, we will be sending you a copy of the full research report. Obviously, any questions or comments you pose today will factor into that final report, but everyone on the call here will get their own copy in short order. We're going to start a conversation. We have a workforce analytics and workforce planning LinkedIn group. There are about 3,500 people now part of that group. We'll start some conversations there. We'd love to get your thoughts on these ideas that we've talked about, what makes a Rockstar different, what you would recommend as being important to close that 10-year gap between firms that are starting today and those that have 3 to 5 years. So we'll look to post a LinkedIn comment and discussion board soon, so you can start to discuss some of the results here as well. I'm going to take a look at some of the questions that have come in here from the audience today. We have about 10 minutes left, so we'll cover just a couple of questions. So one came in about, I assume it's from a smaller firm, about we've looked at slicing this data in a variety of ways, but they're asking about the relationship between organizational size and the level of maturity, and whether it is pretty much always the case that larger firms are more mature. So Reagan, did you see anything in the survey results around organizational size being tied to ability to deliver effective analytics?
Actually, the question or the answer was kind of. We did definitely see that the largest population of organizations that are not doing workforce analytics, that they just don't do workforce analytics today, are around 2,000 to 5,000 employees in size. In general, the larger organizations, so those with 30,000 plus, have been doing workforce analytics for longer, so 3 to 5, 2 to 3 years. But under 30,000 employees, it's pretty much across the board in terms of tenure. So, we do see all sizes of organizations doing workforce analytics across all the tenure bands.
Thank you. And then a question I've wrestled with a couple of times around mergers and acquisitions. We didn't really talk about it today, but I wanted to see whether there was anything in the survey results about organizations using data for workforce analytics. I've often thought there would be a great opportunity. I think about the availability of data, pre-close, and whether we have that kind of information. So we'd love more of a conversation around that. But did you see any more information from the respondents in terms of whether they're using this data for a very, very strategic business issue like merger and acquisition preparation?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, mergers and acquisitions came up quite a bit in the verbatim comments. So we saw a lot of the comments around what organizations are doing with their workforce analytics programs today, centered around things like restructuring business units and identifying where there are redundancies, and definitely specifically calling out mergers and acquisitions. Another thing that we saw was that when we asked organizations what their top challenges were for 2013, mergers and acquisition, I believe about 12% of the respondents said that was one of their top challenges. So it's definitely on the radar.
Great, thank you. Those are the two main questions that came in here. So in a moment, I'll turn it back to Reagan to close that. But firstly, thank you to everyone who participated in the survey and also have attended here today. We thought the findings were interesting. We think there's a great opportunity for workforce analytics moving forward. There's clearly great investments being made in building the resourcing, the technology, and the capability for this as well. And hopefully some of the lessons learned and hypotheses we've outlined today have been useful to you as you think about what the next generation of your workforce analytics function might be. And with that, I'll turn back to Reagan to close it out here.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, so again, thanks everybody for making time to listen in on the results. And again, a big thank you to everybody who participated in the research. We definitely had a lot of fun going through the findings and putting this together to share with you today. And as Mick mentioned, definitely be on the lookout. We will be emailing out a copy of the full research report to everybody online. And also be on the lookout for future research studies from the EPI-USE Visionary Series. So thank you again for your time today. And with that, we will close up the webinar.
The organizer has ended the session, and this call will be disconnected. Goodbye.